Today I'm going to talk about a dogma that's pervasive in the cognitive neuroscience of aging literature. And the dogma is that aging causes brain decline, and brain decline in turn causes cognitive decline. And I don't mean to challenge this dogma directly. I'd be foolish to do so. There's considerable evidence that these relationships exist. But what I do want to do is emphasize today that I think we've overemphasized this dogma in some of our interpretations of particular studies, in particular age-related impairments that we see in memory tasks. As well as associated differences in brain activity, which almost by default are attributed to brain decline in the cognitive neuroimaging literature, and social factors are basically ignored. And the problem here, of course, is that we know that aging research is correlational. Tim Salthouse has written very elegantly about this over the years, and that social factors can influence performance in addition to brain decline as associated with aging. And what I want to do today is give a little progress report on some of the recent work within the false memory literature on stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is the idea that activating negative aging stereotypes can impair cognitive performance in older adults, especially if they identify with the older adult group. And in part, I'm preaching to the choir here. Rebecca Levy has pioneered this research area. And as we were talking about before the talk, there's lots of research over many years that these stereotype threat effects exist, but nevertheless it seems that these social factors are still overlooked in the cognitive neuroscience of aging literature. Brain decline remains the default explanation. And what I'm going to do today is give you two case studies to emphasize this point from the false memory literature. The first case study is going to come from the Deese, Roederer, and McDermott false memory task. Hopefully most of you know how this task works. This is the one where you are presented with lists of semantically related words, like bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, and then later on you falsely remember the word sleep. You thought it was in the list, even though it wasn't in the list. And several years ago I wrote a review of the DRM task, and here are the first 18 published experiments comparing younger and cognitively normal older adults in this false memory task. And what you can see here is that older adults recall fewer of the studied words, not surprising, but they also falsely recall more of these related words like sleep that weren't actually presented. So an age-related increase in false memories. And the dogmatic interpretation of this, very pervasive, is that this has something to do with neural decline in aging. And it probably does, don't get me wrong. If I were to say it wouldn't, I'd be chased out of town, and that's bad because I live here. But here's just some quotes to illustrate this from the literature. This is from the WashU group at Washington University, which just pioneered this research area, where they write declines in frontally mediated cognitive processes, such as source monitoring and strategic processing, play a prominent role in age-related deficits of false memory. Not to pick on them, even in my own work, I've advocated for this point of view. So I wrote 10 years ago, these changes are linked to decline in brain mechanisms and cognitive strategies that are critical for memory. However, a study came out a few years ago by Anna Thomas and Dubois, which blew my mind. It should have blown everybody's mind in this room, where they had people study the DRM lists, and then they took these memory tests. And what you can't see on this slide is I've got a little arrow down here that says they manipulated stereotype threat. And they manipulated stereotype threat just before the test using the procedure that Tom Hess has really championed, which is that in one group of older adults, they told that this is a cognitive aging study, we're interested in how memory declines with aging, please go ahead and take the test. And then in the other group of older adults, the control group, they said this is a language task. They didn't mention aging at all. So this is the group where they're trying to minimize stereotype threat. And here's the results. Compared to younger adults, they did find age-related increases in false memory to these related lures, but these effects were only found in the older adult group where threat was activated. In the group where threat was not activated, there were no age-related increases in false memory. The effect is completely eliminated. So this is basically the counterpart to the Hall study that Liz mentioned before, which showed that you can eliminate age-related differences on true memory, recall of words. Here we're showing it in false memory too. Now, I didn't believe this when I saw this, because this ran against everything that we've been advocating in the literature for 10 years, that you could just wish away aging effects on these tasks, because after all, these aging effects are driven by declining neural structures. How can they be so sensitive to social factors? And the broader implication, of course, is that if typical laboratory procedures activate threat, even if we don't mean to activate threat, after all, our older adults come into these studies, usually we've advertised for older adults, we're doing aging studies of cognition, they know what it's about. If those studies tend to activate threat, then these results suggest that some, or maybe all, of the aging-related increases in false memories that we see might owe to stereotype threat effects instead of brain decline. It's a possibility. But again, I didn't believe it. So we set up to try to replicate these effects in our lab. This was a study by Jessica Wong. The format is cut off here, but it's being published this year, in memory. And basically we did the same sort of setup as Thomas and Dubois, where they studied the DRM list and then they take a memory test. And we manipulated stereotype threat or control just before the memory test. We had a few methodological tweaks. We wanted to do something new. One thing that we did was we warned all of our subjects to try to avoid the false memory effect. Basically, we debriefed them before they took the test. And the reason that we did that was some prior work on my lab indicates that even if you tell people, hey, we're trying to trick you, we're going to give you words like sleep that weren't actually on the list, don't be fooled by those. Even if you tell people that, they still make these false memory errors, which just makes for a more compelling memory illusion. It turns out that it also might have somehow disrupted or altered the effective stereotype threat on his task. So here's the results from that study. And what you can see here is that compared to younger adults, older adults overall are making more false memories. This is false recognition of related words like sleep. But in our hands, the threat group actually showed fewer or a lower false recognition effect compared to the no threat group. So that's the exact opposite finding is what Dubois and Thomas had found. And what we argued is that adding this warning to the false memory task may have motivated an error prevention strategy, and moreover, threat may have increased the use of this strategy. And this is logic that we borrowed from Sarah Barbara, who's here, and Mara Mathur, who've written very nicely about this and published some nice effects in the literature, showing that stereotype threat effects can also interact with the way you frame the task to the subjects and the kind of strategies that they think they should be using when you engage in the task. But before I go too far down that road, I want to also highlight that there were some other methodological differences between these studies. We gave multiple cognitive tests, our participants were older, maybe our results were a fluke, so we decided let's take a step back. There's two conflicting results in the literature. Let's do this all in one giant study and see what replicates and if we can figure it out. And Amy Smith, who was a graduate student with Diana Thomas, took this challenge upon herself as our master's thesis. This was a massive study. She had 200 older adults, normal older adults that were randomly assigned to one of 4 different groups where they study the DRM list, they take the memory test, and then we manipulate either if we activate stereotype threat or the control condition where we say this is not about aging, we just say that this is a language task, we don't mention aging, and we also manipulated whether or not they got the warning. Here are the key results from that study. And this is not yet published, so these data are hot off the presses. Regardless of whether or not we gave people a warning, there were very robust false recognition effects. So very nice DRM illusion. You always get it. That part will always work. But what we found is that threat increased false recognition in both cases. So they were right, we were wrong, at least in part. So regardless of warning, threat increased DRM effect, which is consistent with the original study. Although I will say that there were some individual difference effects in terms of the strength of threat, and they seem to interact with the warning. So I still think there's something about how you frame the task. We haven't fully worked it out yet, but this is where the literature stands. And the bigger point that I wanted to make today with this panel is that task framing and stereotypes clearly impact performance in these false memory tasks. We've known this for a long time, looking at measures of memory accuracy and correct recall. Now we're showing it in measures of false recall and false recognition. Although people don't seem to be paying as much attention as I think they should be. Let me give you one other case study of this before I wrap it up. This case study is going to come from a kind of source monitoring task that Dan Schachter and I devised a couple of years ago, which we call the criterial recollection task. And it's a relatively simple task. So during the study phase, people study a long list of unrelated items, and sometimes they get the item as a word, so you see the word telescope in red here. Sometimes they see a picture of the item like a dragon, sometimes they see both. And then we give a test phase, and on that test phase, in one test block, we ask people to try to remember, did you study this item as a word? That's a hard thing to remember. It's hard to remember the font color that an item had been presented in. On another test block, we ask the same subject, do you remember that this item had been associated with a picture during study? That's a lot easier to do. Pictures are more perceptually distinctive, they're easier to recollect. Here are the behavioral findings from that study. Here I'm showing you recollection accuracy on this recollection test. And in both younger adults and in this group of cognitively normal older adults, what you see is that there is an overall increase in accuracy, so words are harder to recollect than pictures. We also see overall decreases, so the typical aging-related impairments in source memory and recollection. But critically, there's an interaction, so that, thank you so much, so that in older adults, the age-related impairments in recollection are greater when they take this more challenging test, when they take this word test. And The idea here is that this word test is more difficult than the picture test because of the stimulus differences, and as a result, this word test requires more prefrontally mediated monitoring processes at the time of retrieval, different strategies and cognitive control processes that we all use to try to effortlessly search our memory for information. And our older adults might be more impaired on the word test than on the picture test because they have difficulty mobilizing these prefrontal resources due to structural declines. And in this particular study, we scanned people's brains using event-related fMRI during the memory task. And what we found in the top panel here, I'm showing you younger adults, was that, lo and behold, when they take this word test, they're more likely to activate regions of prefrontal cortex, especially dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, compared to the picture test. So they take this hard test, they have to engage in this effortful retrieval monitoring to accurately respond, they recruit these prefrontal resources. Older adults don't do that errand task, even though for older adults as well, this word task is harder than this picture task, suggesting, and if anything, older adults had more activity on the picture test than the word test. That's what's illustrated in blue here. And what this suggests is that older adults are unable to recruit additional prefrontal resources to engage in this task in the same way that younger adults are, consistent with some work from Patty Reuter-Lorenz and others in the audience here. And in our paper, we concluded that these and other findings reported here provide strong evidence for age-related dysfunction of regions of the PFC during retrieval monitoring. So we're embracing the dogma here. Now that I look back at it in the context of this talk, I kind of cringe, because I'm thinking, can we really be so sure that these age-related differences that we see are due to structural declines as a function of aging? We don't have direct evidence for that. What if social factors could be contributing to these kinds of findings as well? And we didn't have that, the data in that study, but we did do a follow-up study. This is a study by Jessica Wong, who's a PhD student in my lab. This was another study in her dissertation, where she had individuals study words, and then they took a recollection memory test. Here we just focus on the word condition because that's where most of the aging action is that we see. And she manipulated stereotype threat either before the encoding phase of the experiment, so that it could affect both encoding or retrieval, or just before the retrieval phase, so it could only affect retrieval processes. To my knowledge, this is the only study that has investigated the effects of these explicit threat manipulations at either encoding or retrieval. If somebody knows of another study that's done that, please let me know, because I can't find it. And this is what Jess found. Here I'm showing you recollection confusions on the source memory task. And what you can see is that, yes, indeed, when we activate stereotype threat, older adults make more recollection confusions on this task compared to older adults that are in the group where we just told them it was a language task. And in this study, the threat effects were even bigger during the encoding phase of the experiment, suggesting that it might have affected how they paid attention to the stimuli, it might have affected the kinds of strategies that they used or didn't use. So just to summarize from those two case studies then, it's very clear that aging is associated with increased memory distortion, as well as differences in corresponding brain activity. These effects tend to be attributed to brain decline in the cognitive neuroscience literature. I'm guilty of doing this myself. Probably, it's not such a bad thing to be guilty about. We all believe that this is the case. But aging stereotypes also play a role. And I would argue that they play the unknown role. You could think of this as an unknown source of variance. A lot of these cognitive aging studies that we really don't know how much of the aging effects are being driven by these social factors versus brain decline and other factors. We've heard a lot about all the other factors. And so the take-home message then is that researchers need to think more about stereotype effects and brain decline, because each of these factors has different implications for how we interpret cognitive tests, both in terms of neuropsychological evaluations and trying to increase the validity of those evaluations in terms of isolating or inferring brain decline that's associated with normal aging or disease, as well as remediation in terms of if you have an older adult who's underperforming because of social factors, that's going to suggest a very different course of action compared to someone who's underperforming because of brain decline. And maybe even more so than that, these things are probably interacting, so it's going to get even more complex, I think, as we move forward, but that'll keep us all in business, and that's okay. And I just want to end by thanking my graduate students and Joe and Liz for putting together such a great panel. It's been great. Thanks.